back to the medical visualization lecture, and in particular to the part on surface visualization. We discussed in the last lecture the process of transforming a set of contours to surfaces. We have seen different situations and problems that occur there, branching problems, tiling problems. We discussed the marching cubes algorithm and its properties, an algorithm that locally considers independent cells and composes a surface out of them. It works rather well if we have a large range of intensity values, like with the original Hounsfield values in CT data. It produces considerable artifacts when applied to binary segmentation masks, and it is often applied in this situation as well. We discussed some refinements and ideas to improve this, in particular the precise marching cubes algorithm. And today we will continue and will look in one more algorithm for surface generation, and in particular on algorithms that post-process a surface generated with marching cubes or one of its variants in order to make it smoother. Smoothing is important because it improves the interpretability of the images. It is not just a matter of taste, it looks a bit nicer, but if you can avoid erroneous artifacts, erroneous strong edges in a surface visualization, that improves the interpretation. Yeah. So this is a 2D illustration showing a set of pixels. Yeah, and if marching cubes would be applied to this, this would generate such a ramp here and another one here. Yeah, that is not ideal. Ideal would be if we would connect these 2 points with each other. Yeah, then we would avoid the strong discontinuity of the surface normals at this point and at this point. But with a local independent treatment of the cells, that's not possible. Precise marching cubes improves the situation, but not so strongly. Yeah, instead of the straight line, we now have a curved line, but still we have this plateau here, and with this the considerable discontinuity. Yeah, so therefore precise marching cubes does not avoid these terrace artifacts that occur often. Yeah, so we have original data. This is a photo of a bony structure. This is how it looks like in MRI data, how it is represented there in a few slices only, and that would be a corresponding surface visualization where you clearly see these terrace artifacts, these discontinuities in the surface normal. Here's an example of an organ of the liver. Yeah, and again you see some areas look nice and have no strong artifacts, but in other areas this problem that I just illustrated is clearly visible. Yeah, so that is the problem description. To add a little bit to this, we will later see in the lecture that illustrative techniques like silhouette rendering and hatchings are also used to convey anatomical surfaces, in particular for learning processes, learning applications. And the question is, how does the smoothness of a surface relates to the use of, for example, silhouette rendering? Yeah, here you see an example of silhouette rendering applied to a liver model. Yeah, and here you see the application of the very same algorithm after this surface model has been smoothed. Yeah, with 3D Studio Max, there is a filter called relaxation filter that is actually a Gaussian smoothing, and that was applied in 7 iterations, so it's a quite severe smoothing. And you see, if you look at the lines, many small lines that you see here do no longer appear here. Yeah, that means illustrative rendering would highlight positions where an object has artifacts, because these discontinuities are considered as something important and are emphasized with illustrative rendering. So in particular, this combination of surface visualization and illustrative rendering requires that we have smooth surface models. Yeah, to further illustrate some problems, we talked about these plateaus and staircase artifacts. We also have detached elements. And to comment on this already, if you have detached elements, this problem will not be solved with a smoothing algorithm. In contrast, the detached elements typically after smoothing have a larger distance than they had before. So they look even more detached. Yeah? So this problem cannot be solved. We discussed this problem yesterday in the last lecture, namely the situation that an elongated structure that is not exactly in the axial direction, there is a risk that this is shown as a separate surface. Yeah, because marching cubes assumes overlapping projections in the individual slices. Yeah, if we think of smoothing, there are many methods available. Yeah, it's not that there is a shortage of smoothing methods. Some of them follow what I would, yeah, ironically say is a bit academic. Um, they have some data, they add a certain level of noise artificially, and then apply their smoothing algorithm designed for this type of noise, and surprise, surprise, they could remove this noise and reconstruct a smooth model again. Yeah, that is nothing that helps in medical visualization a lot. In computer-aided design, this is often used. Imagine you acquire a point cloud of an engine or another type of um, yeah, an engineering device that you want to represent as a 3D model because you don't have a 3D model in the computer already. And then you have a noisy surface that results from this point cloud if you triangulate it, and then apply smoothing methods in order to better represent the geometry of an engine, for example. The models that are used in engineering typically involve sharp edges. So therefore, these smoothing algorithms take into account that sharp edges are important and should be preserved. So these are feature-sensitive methods that analyze the geometry, and as soon as there is a sharp edge, they would preserve it. That is exactly what we do not need in medical visualization. Yeah, the sharp edges, as I have seen on the last shown on the last slide, are the results of terrace and staircase artifacts. They are due to the limited resolution of the scanners. Yeah, so these should not be preserved. Yeah, and therefore it's really not so clear which of the many smoothing algorithms should we use for medical surface models. Let's discuss a bit the requirements. What do we want to have, and also how we can evaluate whether the requirements are actually fulfilled. We want to remove high frequent noise. That means many small bumpy changes on a surface. However, large scale features, that these should be preserved. If we want to analyze whether we are successful or not, the most obvious thing would be, well, we just look at a number of different results and visually decide which of them is better. Yeah, so qualitatively. That's not bad, but it should be added by something that's more quantitative. Yeah, the question is, are there measures that we can use and they tell us whether or not we have achieved a certain amount of smoothing. And that is indeed the case. If we compute curvature along a surface mesh, curvature can be estimated by fitting quadratic surfaces, then we can analyze how the curvature behaves if we apply certain smoothing techniques, if we change parameters of the smoothing techniques, and what we would like to see is that the total curvature, yeah, the sum over the curvature of the individual triangles, the individual patches of a surface, that should be reduced. After smoothing, we expect a lower curvature, and the extent to which we reduce the curvature tells us how successful we are. Imagine we have a plane surface, yeah, and the plane surface is rough. It has many small bumps. Then the overall curvature is quite considerable. If we smooth this in the extent that the planar surface is really a plane, then the curvature is zero. Yeah, a plane has zero curvature. Yeah, after smoothing, curvature should be lower. The overall curvature of a medical surface model will not be zero, also not after smoothing. Yeah, because an organ, for example, is not a plane, but the curvature will be reduced. Speed is an important factor. Yeah, some smoothing algorithms take a lot of time. Um, that's even the case in 2D image smoothing. Yeah, the best algorithms there are non-linear, non-anisotropic um, diffusion filtering methods that simulate a diffusion process by means of a set of integral equations. And that takes really a lot of time. Yeah, so the results are nice. In particular, the anisotropic character is nice, but it takes a lot of time. So we need in practice methods that are not too slow, and accuracy is important. The question is, of course, how accuracy can be measured. So, for example, you could say, I consider the original surface as correct, which is a simplification, yeah, because an anatomical surface does not contain terrace artifacts. But let's assume for the moment that we can consider this as correct. Then we could measure the distances um, to the original surface from the smoothed surface and can take this into account. And maybe we are not so strongly interested in the average distance, but primarily we could be interested in the maximum distance. So what is the largest error that could be made based on this technique? Volume preservation is another measure. So if our original surface has a certain volume, we can compute this. Now we smooth the model in the sense that we relocate vertices, yeah, displace them, and as a consequence, the shapes, the faces, of course, also change. The question is, what is the volume that results after smoothing? Um, in general, there is a tendency that the volume gets smaller. Yeah, objects shrink. That is not always the case. There are some situations, at least possible, they do not occur very often, where a model even is enlarged by smoothing. And that is the case if you have concave base. These get filled in the smoothing process and therefore added to the volume. But everything that is convex, yeah, like the tip of my nose, that would, as a consequence of smoothing, be moving further and further to the other parts of the face, and thus the volume of the nose gets smaller and smaller. Yeah, so volume preservation is another important measure. Smoothing could be done at different stages of the process. Most approaches, and I will focus on them, take a surface model as input and smooth it. However, it is also possible, and that is shown here in André Neubauer's work, that smoothing is arrived already at the image level. Yeah. If you think back of a binary segmentation result, there we have the 1 representing foreground voxels and 0 representing background voxels, only these two values. Here they used, instead of 1, a 100 for the foreground voxels, and then applied a morphological image analysis approach that leads to smoother edges. Yeah. So you see here the result, and not only the resulting contour in 2D, but also the underlying data. And instead of only having 0 and 100 as we had it originally, we now have intermediate values like 54, 33, 26. Yeah? So a number of different values, and this is a more fortunate situation to apply the marching cubes algorithm. Here you see the results that was the unsmooth variance, and that is the result after smoothing completely at this imaging level. Yeah, I would not say that smoothness here is perfect. Here are still edges that are anatomically not meaningful, but it's considerably reduced. And that is particularly important for endoscopy. We discussed this topic briefly also in the last video lecture, um, because there the camera is very close to these anatomical structures and artifacts appear quite prominently. So, but of course I should not only comment on the images, but also at least briefly explain what they actually did. In the first step, they applied an erosion. Yeah, erosion means something gets smaller. Yeah, so instead of these many voxels here that get a 100, all the boundary voxels are removed, and these are in fact the majority of the voxels, and only these 2 by 2 remain, where the value is unaltered. That gets a 100. Yeah, for the boundary voxels that are subject to erosion, they are not set just to the background voxel, but instead they get a value that is computed from the previous foreground value, and that is 100, and the previous background value, that is a 1. And this difference is yeah, taken with a factor of 1/3, and that leads to these 66 values that you see here. Yeah, that is a result of the first step, erosion and modification. So if this would be the only thing and we would apply a surface generation algorithm to this, then we would underestimate the surface. It would get smaller because we have not increased any value, but instead we have only reduced some values. So therefore we need a second step that, yeah, that is the opposite procedure to an erosion, and that is a dilatation. Yeah, so we go outward from our resulting image and make another modification. Here we take into account the ISO value, that is 50. Yeah, so exactly the middle between V1 and V2, and with this we have the difference here, that is 100, and d is the distance. So that leads to different modifications for pixels that are 2 pixels apart from our object, or only 1 pixel apart. Yeah. So with this step, we modify the pixels that are outside and that had a 0 before. Yeah, they no longer have zeros, only those that are 2 pixels away, and you see this relates only to these 2 pixels. Yeah, the others, according to this formula, get these values of 33, 6, or 26. Yeah, and that leads to an improvement already. So it is possible to do this also on this level. But in the following, let's discuss how polygon smoothing is applied. That means we have a surface model and we want to smooth it. Yeah? Smoothing means translating nodes, translating vertices, the points that you see here. I told you already that some models, in particular in engineering, have these strong edges, as you see here, feature edges they are called here. So these are the situations if an algorithm detects such features, then it typically fixes these nodes and says everything else may be translated, but these stay where they are. Yeah, smoothing can be carried out as an optimization problem. So if it's really true that curvature characterizes how smooth or how not smooth a surface is, then we can try to minimize curvature indeed. Yeah. So here the mean curvature is taken into account. That is a value that could be positive or negative. Yeah. And after smoothing, you see the values here representing low values. The colors representing low values are much more dominant. Yeah, or here you see this even clearer. You could either minimize total curvature or total surface area. Yeah, because a bumpy surface also has a higher surface area, which is not desirable. Yeah, so these are approaches that are quite computationally intensive, but they lead to generally good results. Depends a bit on which kind of optimizer is used, but in general this is quite good. Yeah, what I want to present in the following is a comparison of mesh smoothing techniques and their application to medical surface models. We did this in our own group. So one of our PhD students made such a comprehensive analysis, taking into account major smoothing algorithms as well as their parameters. So in total, it was a quite large parameter space that needs to be explored. Smoothing algorithms that we considered were all local. Yeah, that is in contrast to the methods I just mentioned a minute before, where total curvature is minimized. These are global methods. Yeah, but global methods take a lot of time. Local methods are faster, like marching cubes is a local method. So when you want to use a local method, the question is how local it should be. The most typical variant for a local algorithm is as follows. If I think about modifying this point P as part of my smoothing process, I take into account the surrounding points Q1 to Q6. Very often these are 6 neighbors. Yeah. So these are just the points that are connected via an edge to my point that I want to translate. That is called the umbrella neighborhood also. Yeah, maybe this little sketch makes this clear to you. So as a consequence of smoothing, the tip of the umbrella would go a little bit down. It gets translated in the average value of the surrounding. Yeah, it has a certain influence, the point itself, so it will not just be in the average position of the other 6, but it goes in this direction. So that is a topological kind of neighborhood. Yeah. In contrast, we could also think of an Euclidean distance, namely, we say we just take into account all points that are 5 millimeters away. Yeah, but that is a bit more difficult. On the one hand, it's difficult to compute efficiently which neighbors do we have in a certain neighborhood. And the even more severe problem is we need a certain number of points to take into account for smoothing. If we want to use a fixed distance, we cannot know in advance how many points will be in this fixed Euclidean distance. It could be too few, then we have to enlarge the distance, for example, which makes it computationally even more difficult. Or we can get too many points, which is also not desirable. So therefore, it's a good idea to use the topological distance. The topological distance 1 is this umbrella neighborhood. The topological neighborhood of 2 would also take into account all points that have a path length of at most 2 to the current point. Yeah. So then we have, yeah, often 30, 35 points. We have to locate them and we have to take them into the consideration for the smoothing process. So that definitely takes longer, but one may expect that taking into account a larger neighborhood makes the results a bit better. Yeah. So we start with Laplacian smoothing. That's the most simple approach. It's frequently used. It leads to a good smoothing effect. However, it is not very accurate, and that becomes particularly obvious if you have rather small objects and if you smooth rather aggressively, I would call it. So that means if you smooth several times iteratively with a smoothing factor that is not too small. Yeah. So the two parameters of Laplacian smoothing is on the one hand a smoothing factor, that is this guy here, and the second parameter is the number of iterations, how often you apply this. So you have an old point P, you want to apply the smoothing operation and compute its new position P1. and P or P prime, and P prime is computed from P and from the difference between all the neighbors in the umbrella neighborhood to P. Yeah, so we sum this up. Here we have our smoothing factor, and this is divided by the number of points. Yeah, in most cases that is 6, but not always. Yeah, that is what happens here. And it is realized in many toolkits. As an example, the VTK smooth polydata filter is in fact Laplacian smoothing. Here we applied this to the model of a lymph node. Yeah, that was the original model, clearly not smooth. Yeah, you can still recognize the original slices. We applied it 20 times with a weighting factor of smoothing factor of 0.5, and that is our result. And the volume was reduced by 20%. That's a bit too much. Yeah, so that is the simple Laplacian smoothing. Just to illustrate a bit more what happens there. Yeah, that is our point that we consider. And if we illustrate this in 2D, then we only have two neighbors, Q1 and Q2, and P will be translated in the direction of the line that connects Q1 and Q2. Yeah, so here you see this line, P prime goes in this direction. That is the middle point between the two. Yeah? And if we go further, then Q1 is subject to this translation, goes in this direction, and Q2 goes in this direction. Yeah, it goes not that far, but it goes in this direction, depending on the smoothing factor. Yeah, that's what happens here. Yeah, and that would be a result after smoothing. And that also explains why it gets smaller. Yeah, the convex parts of a surface, and this is the majority of the surface features, that gets smaller. There was the idea, well, we use this Laplacian smoothing, but we introduce a correction step, which translates the points a little back, not in the original direction. It's a bit smarter than this. And then we can improve the accuracy. Yeah, that is in principle a good idea, but to apply it in practice has one problem, and that is now we have additional parameters that are related to this correction step. Yeah, so how strong this correction step should be, and how the shifting of the neighbors is actually incorporated. So in addition to the two parameters that Laplacian smoothing has, Laplacian smoothing with correction has 4 parameters. Yeah? And for a user, it's difficult to find a good combination of 4 parameters. So ideally, you have to come up with a preset so that the user can, in most cases, rely on this. Yeah? So to give you the reference for this, Laplace with correction was introduced in 1999 by Vollmer. Yeah? The low-pass filter is another idea. It's a little bit similar. It's also a two-step approach. It's a filter in one direction with a factor lambda, and in the opposite direction with the factor mu. And that is based on observations and analogies from image processing, yeah, from Gabriel Taubin. Yeah, and this low-pass filter is actually quite good. Yeah. So here you see this correction step illustrated. After P was translated to this point, P star, it has a second step, the correction step, which moves it in this direction, leading to P prime. Yeah, let's see some examples. In original model, noise was added, Laplacian smoothing leading to considerable smoothing after a longer time, whereas Laplacian with correction, that is the bottom row here, also achieves a smoothing effect and also an increasing smoothing effect. Yeah, so this looks much better compared to the noisy input model, but the volume is preserved. We go back to our lymph node because we are in the medical visualization lecture. That was the original method, model. We have already seen the strong volume shrinkage with Laplacian smoothing, and we see here with the correction step We have not such a smoothness achieved that we have here, but we can preserve the volume almost perfectly, 99.8%. Yeah? And I would argue this is at least smoother than the original model is. Yeah? So that was Laplacian smoothing with correction. The low-pass filter works like this. It has the Laplacian step, and then we apply to this value a second step that goes in a different direction, and it goes in a different direction because mu is chosen accordingly. Yeah. So lambda and mu have different signs. Lambda is positive and mu is negative, and also the magnitude differs slightly. So the suggestion from Gabriel Taubin is that the mu value has the slightly larger magnitude, 2% larger magnitude. Yeah. So here's a result from a later tutorial that Gabriel Taubin gave. That was the input data, again quite artificially constructed, and then after applying several times the smoothing, that can really be reduced and the original sphere can be reconstructed. Yeah. Yeah, one problem that even a good filtering process like low-pass filtering cannot ensure is that small details are preserved. Yeah, so if you look here, it's encircled, there is a small detail, and after a lot of smoothing, that really has gone away. Yeah, so that can even happen with low-pass filtering. So before commenting on the comparison of different methods, I want to briefly comment on the surface models that we have used for this comparison. Yeah, that is quite important. Which objects should we use? Obviously more than one. Otherwise, you would say, well, that works for this one object. So a larger magnitude is probably good. But the question is primarily what is a representative set of medical surface models. And we thought we should find objects of different categories. We have compact objects. We have already seen one example for this, namely the lymph node. Compact means that the extent in all three spatial dimensions is roughly the same. We have not so often flat objects that have a rather large extent in two dimensions, but only a small extent in the third dimension. And we have elongated structures. Yeah? And we would not be surprised to see that the method that performs best, or the combination of a method and parameters that performs best, is different for elongated, flat, or compact objects. Yeah? So what are the criteria for the comparison? The quality, the volume preservation, and also the runtime. We use all algorithms with 5 iterations, 10, 20, and 50 iterations. More than 50 is certainly too much. The smoothing factor or weighting factor is also adapted from 0.05 to 0.1, 0.3, 5, 7, and 9. So we have 6 different weighting factors. And we use the topological 1 neighborhood, the umbrella operator, and the topological 2 neighborhood. Yeah? And here are our models: a liver, a lymph node, a muscle as a structure which is planar, a large skeletal structure, a vascular tree, and just one artery. They have a different complexity also in terms of the geometry involved. So for example, the liver has 37,000 polygons, whereas the lymph node only has 3,400. That's a quite small structure. Or here this artery has a little less than 2,000 faces. And you see also the number of vertices and voxels. You may expect that the runtime depends on the number of faces and vertices. Yeah. So here you see what happens to the liver, for example. Yeah, that was the original liver. And after we applied smoothing with weighting factor 0.5 and 20 iterations, so that's quite severe smoothing, we lose 9% of the volume with Laplacian smoothing. the volume is preserved when the correction step is applied, also with low-pass filtering. Yeah, so this is quite convincing. And yeah, the difference whether we have the first order neighborhood or the second order neighborhood is not so important. However, the runtime increases considerably. Yeah. Later we performed some optimizations. We could reduce this here to something like 30 seconds, but yeah, still there is a difference. What happens to our lymph node? The lymph node is smaller, so therefore it's more sensitive to volume shrinkage. We easily make a larger error when we have a smaller object. Yeah, you see that yeah, with the correction step we are again quite precise. Also with low pass filtering, with one topological one neighborhood and two neighborhood as well. Here you see what happens to our skeletal model, yeah, the original model. That is not artificial noise. That was really the result from translating the segmentation result from the slices to a surface with marching cubes. Yeah. Laplacian smoothing leads to strong improvement of the visual quality, and because we have a larger structure, it's not so sensitive to volume loss. So here we have 94% of the volume that is preserved, whereas the other methods again preserve the volume almost perfectly. Yeah, what happens to the carotid artery where we have a detached element? One of the problems of marching cubes in case of elongated structures. That was the original. That is the situation after smoothing with Laplacian. And here are the other methods, Laplacian with the second order neighborhood and the correction step. And you see that more or less the distance between these two detached elements gets stronger after smoothing. So whereas I would argue that if the user sees an image like this, probably mentally he would integrate this. He knows this belongs together, it's in the same direction, it has the same size, there's a small gap, well, probably an artifact, but that belongs together. But if you see this, that's no longer so clear. Yeah, the detached element is smaller, much smaller than the gap between the object to which it belongs. So therefore, you would probably not recognize this correctly. Yeah, that is a side effect of smoothing. I told you that curvature is so important to understand what we have achieved in smoothing. Yeah, so here you see an original method, and here you see that this was smooth with different methods, low pass filtering with topological one neighborhood, for example. And the question is how curvature is affected. Yeah, dark blue represents extremely low curvature, red represents very high curvature. Here you see very low curvature at many areas, but also many situations where you have these average middle curvature values. Yeah? And that gets reduced here from left to right considerably. We still have regions with not negligible curvature represented by the turquoise color, but only at positions where this really makes sense, yeah, because their curvature is indeed considerable, whereas the other parts of the bone, which are more or less planar, really have no curvature. Some diagrams may also help to improve the understanding, namely what happens to the volume if I apply an algorithm like Laplacian smoothing or Laplacian smoothing with correction to certain methods. This relates all to Laplacian smoothing, and you see how strongly the volume is reduced for the different models. Yeah, and you see with the lymph node it goes down very fast, yeah, to a region where the volume really is preserved very badly. Yeah, the same happens to the vascular tree and also to this muscle. Only for a large compact structure that can be neglected. Yeah. So I will not comment on all the details, but derive some recommendations and observations. The low-pass filter is the best solution for all object classes. For small objects, the topological neighborhood of 2 is really beneficial. Yeah? We need more time for this. That's not so nice, but it's beneficial. Yeah, we should apply a larger number of iterations, and a smoothing factor of 0.7 turned out to be good. For flat objects, a topological neighborhood of 1 and approximately 20 iterations is often good. For elongated and branched objects, nothing really works well. And that's the reason why we will later discuss surface visualization techniques for vascular trees, yeah, that are deliberately developed for this situation. Yeah. Branching elongated structures need a special treatment. Yeah, I want to comment on one more algorithm because I like it a lot, since it really aims in a convincing manner at the trade-off between accuracy and smoothness. And that's called constrained elastic surface nets. Sometimes it's abbreviated CESN, yeah, CESN, from Sarah Gibson. Here, the relaxation of the surface is constrained by the grid resolution that we have, such that every point can only be translated within the grid cell to which it belongs. That means the error that we have is guaranteed to be small under all circumstances for all parts of the model, and the order of magnitude of this error is the spatial resolution of the data from which this surface was computed. Yeah? So if it was a very high resolution CT scan with 0.5 millimeter slice distance, well, then the error that we make here is also restricted to be below 0.5 millimeters. Yeah? So we preserve the accuracy that the image acquisition technique gave us. Yeah? We have seen this already. We have seen what marching cubes is doing, and precise marching cubes is doing. Let's have a look what the constrained elastic surface nets algorithm is doing. That really produces what I would consider the optimum representation. Yeah? So that's quite nice. Let's look a little bit more in detail what happens here. Yeah, this is the cell in which this point is allowed to move. Yeah, it consists of one half of its left cell and one half of its right cell. Yeah, so here we see for another point in which area it can be moved, and that would be the result after applying the algorithm. Yeah. Let's look at some images. Yeah, a rectangle slightly translated, and yeah, if it's discretely represented with pixels, then it's no longer a rectangle. How this looks like with constrained elastic smoothing after one iteration and after 30 iterations, and that is quite convincing. Yeah, the blue points here represent the isoline that is generated. The same was applied here in 3D. So that's really a nice algorithm. In MevisLab, there are modules like the Laplace filter, also with correction, and the LowPass filter. Yeah, at the end, I want to comment on some techniques that were developed in order to make smoothing context dependent. Yeah, so we now are interested in a kind of smoothing where certain parts of a surface are smoothed stronger than others. Distance-aware smoothing was a first idea in this area. That was also done in our research group, part of a later PhD study. And here the idea was, if I have a tumor and an essential structure in the surrounding, like a vascular structure, then the distance to this structure in the surrounding needs to be preserved. That's why it's called distance-aware. But other parts of the surface can be smoothed stronger. Yeah, and that is what you see here. This object is smoothed stronger when it is far away from the object in which we are interested. that helps in particular to assess safety margins around a pathology that should be removed. Yeah, that's essential for intervention planning, radiation treatment planning, and surgery planning. Yeah. So here you see an artificial situation. We have this noisy plane. We have a sphere, and we want to preserve the estimation of the distance to the sphere. And that means we can smooth strongly in these areas that are far away from the tumor, shown in green, whereas yellow and red represents that we are closer to the tumor, so their smoothing is considerably reduced. Yeah? That is distance-aware smoothing. We compute the Euclidean distance to all relevant neighboring structures and scale the smoothing based on this. We can scale it linearly. We could also do it exponentially in such a way that we even stronger would avoid smoothings close to the particular surface, and only if we are further away increase the amount of smoothing. Yeah. Here you see some examples. Again, the situation with the tumor in the neck region, and yeah, this vascular structure here is particularly important. That was Laplacian smoothing, and this is a Laplacian smoothing with this modification which makes it distance aware. This distance awareness can be integrated in all of the smoothing approaches we have discussed so far, also with the low-pass filtering. Yeah. So here is the minimum distance to the risk structure, 0.5 millimeter. If we apply default Laplacian as done here, that increases to more than 2 millimeters. It pushes the objects away from each other because they shrink. Yeah, but with distance-aware smoothing, we can make sure that we have the same minimal distance that we originally had. Yeah. Yeah, so this could also be combined with volume preserving methods like the low pass filter. Yeah, I was a bit too fast here. So here we see the original model, and here we see how smoothing is applied, and the colors tell us about the inverse amount of smoothing. So we have smoothed a lot where things are green because there it was safer to smooth, and in other areas not. No, that was not correct. That's the deviation to the original model. So the deviation here in the green areas is 0. That means we have not changed something here where we are close to the artery, whereas here we have changed a lot, which is not a problem because we are far away from this risk structure. Yeah. So color is the distance to the original model. Yeah, smoothing may lead to volume loss, we have seen, and also to details that are removed. Most of the problems with respect to smoothness occur due to the limited spatial resolution, and in particular to the fact that we often have a rather large slice distance, whereas the in-plane resolution is smaller. So a further idea of a kind of context-aware mesh smoothing is, let us try to find the vertices where this staircase artifacts really occur. We call this staircasiness. How staircasey is a particular region, and we want to focus smoothing on these regions where we indeed have staircase artifacts. Yeah, so that is a second idea. We have to determine the orientation of the image data. So what was the original slicing direction? We also have to understand how strongly the distance between the layers differs from the original, the in-plane resolution, and then we can come up with such a process. So first we calculate the surface orientation relative to the slice orientation. Green means that is in plane, whereas red means it has a high angle to this, yeah, 90-degree angle. Then we identify points where we have a change of the surface orientation. Actually, these points where the discontinuities occur. Yeah? And by the way, that strongly depends on how it is oriented. Yeah? If we would rotate the muscle, then we would not see these red points here. Yeah? These red points are the points where we have regions close to each other that are in plane resolution, in the plane and orthogonal to the plane, so the surface orientation changes considerably. And based on this, we compute weights that are used as input for the smoothing process. We can combine this with distance-based smoothing, so then it's staircase and distance aware, but also with any other type of mesh smoothing. Yeah. So this shows again the relation between the model orientation and the layer orientation of the scanner. Yeah. Here this is quite high. So if we are close to a staircase vertex, that is the staircase vertex, we smooth strongly, whereas if we are further away, here we are far away, we do not smooth at all. Yeah. So these points really, a lot of points are not changed at all. Yeah, so we iterate over all potential staircases and caps. A cap is this, yeah, an object ends here, which is also not natural and leads to a strong discontinuity. So therefore, smoothing should be applied here as well. Yeah, we count the directional changes. We remove the staircases and the plateaus, these caps here, from the lists of candidates if the direction is constant for the plateau. Yeah, then it does not need to be changed. Yeah, so here is a result. This is our liver model we have seen several times. Here the staircasiness is quite high, where it is orange and red. And that is after smoothing. We have very few red colors. So we have changed this considerably. Also, if you look visually, that is quite smooth. But for all the points that are marked green here already, we have changed nothing. Less than 10% of the vertices have been changed at all. Yeah. So let's look at this model of the arteria carotis again. First, we see the staircase weighting, so the staircasiness, which is 0 for the blue points, and for the white points it is 1, and for the light blue points it's somewhere in between. Laplacian smoothing is applied, and we see that the distance to the original surface is sometimes quite high, up to 0.4 millimeters, whereas with staircase-aware smoothing, we see very few red colors, in particular here where we have to make this rounder, this cup, yeah. But most of the regions are green, saying that we have nothing changed, and therefore the distance to the original surface also is 0. Yeah. So let me summarize this second lecture on surface generation. We discussed the process of transforming a set of contours in surfaces. We have seen that this is quite complex. It can be modified at different stages. Simple methods may lead to good visual results, but may produce errors. And in particular for elongated objects or small objects, these errors can be severe. Yeah? Surfaces that result from binary segmentations are often bumpy and include staircasing artifacts. That led us to discuss smoothing methods that remove the noise, like noise is removed in image processing. Here volume shrinkage is the most severe problem that may occur. Some advanced methods correct for this and can avoid this. One method we have seen, constrained elastic surface nets, where the error indeed can be restricted to be in the same order of magnitude as the spatial resolution from which this surface was generated, from this medical imaging device. Let me briefly show and comment on the literature. I have not mentioned too many references here, so more or less they are all quite famous and important. Gabriel Taubin's work here relates to the low-pass filter, yeah, that was introduced in this publication, so therefore this, I would say, is quite important. Myers et al., obviously some page number here is wrong, but it is a long article that describes all the processes when translating from contours to surfaces, so that's quite important. Our comparison of mesh smoothing algorithms, is published at the Simulation and Visualization Conference, and from Tobias Mönch's work, a kind of summarizing article appeared in the Computers and Graphics journal, Context-Aware Mesh Smoothing for Biomedical Applications. Yeah. If you want to start reading a bit more on this, I would recommend to you the state-of-the-art report from Gabriel Taubin that summarizes and compares many methods, not only the variants of the low-pass filter he himself has introduced. Yeah, with this, I'm at the end and want to thank you for your attention.